When I say the word pirate, who or what is the first thing that comes to your mind? Do you imagine an overpowering, intense, and kind of frightening figure? A man armed to the teeth with cutlasses and flintlocks, constantly prepared for battle? Maybe a tall figure that demands the attention of everyone wherever he goes? If this is what you imagine, what you are likely picturing is a man known as Blackbeard. Blackbeard, also known as Edward Teach or Thatch, was an infamous English pirate of the early 18th century. He initially served as a privateer for Britain during Queen Anne's War, which was a conflict between Britain and France over control of North American territories. After the war's conclusion in 1713, Teach found himself unemployed and lacking funds or any direction. However, his stint as a privateer had provided him with skills for a potentially more profitable endeavor, which is piracy. Now, unlike privateering, piracy afforded no constraints or regulations. You basically only answered to yourself and your crew. Now, Teach started down this path by taking various jobs with crews based in the Bahamas before becoming an indispensable member of Benjamin Hornigold's crew in 1716. After earning Hornigold's trust, Teach gained the chance to captain his very own ship within Hornigold's fleet, and he was so good that he served as second in command for about a year and a half until Hornigold retired from piracy in 1717. Now, when Hornigold retired, Teach decided it was time to sort of set off on his own. To do this, he would need a better and deadlier ship, and sometime in 1717, he and his crew captured a French slave vessel known as the La Concorde. After their capture, he fitted the ship with nearly 40 cannons and renamed the ship the Queen Anne's Revenge. With a new flagship and control of his very own fleet, it didn't take long for Teach to rise to infamy. In December of 1717, a merchant ship captain described the events of his ship being ransacked by Teach. He was described as a tall man with a long black beard. This description obviously gave way to the nickname we know now. Now, later accounts from victims and witnesses of Blackbeard's raids offered additional details about his appearance. It was reported that he sometimes braided his long beard with very fine ribbon and was typically seen wearing all black clothes. He carried multiple flintlock pistols in a sling over his shoulder, which were always prepared to fire at a moment's notice. Now, in his most dramatic display, he would place slow-burning fuses under his hat and ignite them, which sort of created this image of a very menacing figure, which was this towering man dressed all in black, heavily armed, with a fiery head of hair. In all honesty, much of this was just for show. Blackbeard tried to use his intense presence and theatrics to attempt to win battles before a drop of blood was even spilled. And more often than not, it worked. If someone was unlucky enough to encounter Blackbeard, they often would immediately surrender and let their ship be looted. And Blackbeard would continue patrolling the Caribbean until late 1717. Now, during late 1717, Blackbeard started to hear news that there was going to be escalating efforts to combat piracy in the Caribbean. And to that point, British warships were beginning to be dispatched to address the issue of pirates in the Caribbean. Now, in response to this, he ended up settling in Bath, North Carolina, and pursued a pardon under the British Act of Grace. Now, this act offered immunity for all past acts of piracy to pirates who surrendered themselves and ceased their activities. Eventually, Blackbeard did receive the pardon, and Blackbeard retired from piracy. But once a pirate, always a pirate. Less than a month after receiving that pardon, Blackbeard returned to his old ways. However, even before Blackbeard's return to the high seas, numerous officials were already looking to capture or kill him. Specifically, the governor of Virginia was determined to end Blackbeard's piracy, and he personally funded his own fleet to pursue him in North Carolina. So on November 22nd, 1718, two ships approached Blackbeard's hideout on Ocracoke Island, and as anticipated, Blackbeard and his crew engaged and inflicted substantial damage on the vessels. After Blackbeard and his crew decommissioned one of the attacking ships, he ordered the boarding of the other. Now, when they boarded, they discovered the deck was pretty much empty, but this was actually a deliberate trick by the ship's captain. Hidden below that ship the crew, like, hidden out down in the barracks, the crew of that ship did a surprise attack, which did catch Blackbeard and his men off guard. The unexpected assault caught the group off guard, which quickly left them outnumbered, and despite a brief attempt to rally his men, Blackbeard ended up finding himself isolated and surrounded by the more seasoned and better equipped attackers. Initially, he was engaged in combat with the ship's captain, and Blackbeard quickly gained the upper hand briefly before being overwhelmed and ultimately being killed by the British military men. Then, after his death, Blackbeard's head was removed as a token of proof, where it was later hung from the bow of the ship as it was hung from the bow of the ship that he actually attempted to board, and would later be placed on a pike at a Virginia port as a warning to any other would-be pirates. Now, given that rather quick summary I just gave, you might be sort of led to believe that Blackbeard was just another pirate who lived the stereotypical life of a pirate and died because of it. However, it's not really that simple, because in actuality, Blackbeard was a surprisingly complex person who lived a surprisingly complex life. Part of that complexity is the idea of Blackbeard himself. Blackbeard, as we know, wasn't really a real person. He was a character, an exaggerated personality of a man, and that man's name was Edward Teach. So, join me as we take a more in-depth look at the life and ultimate demise of Edward Blackbeard Teach. Frustratingly, but also unsurprisingly, there is very little information about Teach's life before his time as a pirate. However, we can fill in a few unknowns with sporadic documents, information, and reports about Blackbeard from outside sources. For example, reports suggest that Blackbeard was born in Bristol, England. Additionally, at the time of his death, Blackbeard was believed to be just under 40 years old. Since he died in 1718, we can estimate that he was born sometime between late 1670 and early 1680. With his birthplace and a decent grasp of his possible birth date, we can assume a few other things. So, by the 1670s and 80s, Bristol was already a pretty well-established port, and was constantly visited by merchants looking to sell their cargo. So, considering the birthplace of Bristol, Teach would have been surrounded by merchants and tradesmen, and could have possibly been inclined to pursue a career in merchant work or tradesmanship. However, Teach likely also came into contact with individuals who pursued another more exciting line of employment, which was privateering. Now, privateering, in the simplest terms, was legal piracy. Private ship owners could receive a letter of marque from a government body, in this context that would be England, and would be permitted to attack and plunder ships of rival countries during war. During Blackbeard's life, England was constantly in and out of wars. Given this, privateering was becoming a pretty steady source of employment and income, and would have been far more lucrative than working as a traditional tradesperson. Now, when exactly Teach first pursued a career in privateering is unknown because, like I said, up until Blackbeard started terrorizing the seas of the New World, there is very little solid information about him. At first, he would have been little more than one of the thousands of individuals looking to profit off of England's wars and their opponents. Initially, Teach likely would have sought safer employment as a crewmate on a merchant's vessel, and more than likely he would have set off during his teenage years sometime between 1695 and 1700. Now, following popular trade routes, one of the first places Blackbeard or Teach would have landed would have been Jamaica. At the time, Jamaica was ruled by England and served as a haven for privateers seeking to profit off England's enemies, attempting to travel through the Caribbean. Now, by all accounts of his later life, Teach was a highly intelligent and competent sailor. Because of this, he would have likely had no difficulty landing a position as a crewmate for a privateer. Because of that, Teach likely bounced between crews and vessels as a privateer until the Queen Anne's War ended in 1713. When the war ended, Teach and others like him found themselves without work, but were now equipped with skills suited for acts of violence and thievery on the high seas. So, fortunately for him, another line of work put those skills front and center: piracy. Now, just before or after the war ended, Teach had likely taken up residence in the Bahamas. In the same way that Jamaica was a haven for privateers, the Bahamas served as a haven for pirates. Similar to how he bounced between crews as a privateer, Teach likely was part of multiple pirate crews from 1713 to 1716. It is presumed that in the latter half of 1716, Teach finally found steady employment under Captain Benjamin Hornigold. Benjamin Hornigold was another British sailor who served as a privateer before turning to piracy in 1713. Hornigold rose to power very quickly and commanded a decent-sized fleet of ships by the beginning of 1714. He and multiple other pirates were responsible for transforming the Bahamas into the pirate haven. Specifically, Hornigold played a key role in the establishment and improvement of a pirate republic on the Bahamian island of New Providence in the town of Nassau. By the time that Teach met Hornigold, Hornigold would have been well established and well equipped. That being said, Hornigold saw clear potential in Teach, who had been slowly but surely establishing himself as a fearsome pirate in his own right. Hornigold was so confident in Teach's ability that he offered him a position as his second in command, as well as his very own vessel to captain. Teach obviously accepted that offer, and this is when we sort of start to get those solid reports of Teach and his activities. From the beginning of this mentorship, Hornigold and Teach were highly proficient and highly feared. They were responsible for the capture and looting of multiple vessels in the Caribbean. In most reports of those two's conquests, Hornigold was the main topic of conversation. However, some reports began to focus on his new right-hand man. The first reports you see of Teach, he's described as a fierce captain who was in charge of a decently armed sloop and a sizable crew. Then, in September of 1717, they added another captain and vessel to their fleet. The captain was a man named Stede Bonnet. Bonnet, the easiest way I could say, he was quite a character. He was born in Barbados but was of English heritage. And what makes him so interesting is his upbringing. He was born into a wealthy family who owned a large plot of land in Barbados that Bonnet was set to inherit. However, Bonnet seemed to believe that this life didn't really suit him. And in 1717, he purchased a vessel called the Revenge, hired a crew, and began patrolling the Caribbean and the East Coast. Although Bonnet had money to spare on these excursions, there was something he desperately lacked: experience. For all intents and purposes, Bonnet was a terrible pirate. His experience led him to getting injured multiple times, and he was unable to maintain any semblance of control over his crew. Because of this, when Teach and Hornigold took Bonnet in, it didn't take long for Bonnet's crew to realize that Teach was a far superior captain. Most of Bonnet's crew abandoned him and sought to join Teach's crew, and honestly, it seems that Bonnet was quite aware of his ineffectiveness and didn't hold even a slight grudge against his old crew or Teach. Soon after he was taken in, Bonnet surrendered both his crew and vessel to Teach. Now, you may be curious as to why Bonnet surrendered his belongings to Teach instead of Hornigold. Interestingly, sometime in the latter half of 1717, Teach had essentially become independent. While he did still fly under the flag of Hornigold's fleet, Teach had begun forging his own path and would soon cement himself in pirate legend. So, why did Teach begin going solo? Well, most likely it was due to a disagreement between him and Hornigold. As a former privateer under the British flag, Hornigold only attacked and plundered ships of French and Spanish origins. If Hornigold encountered a British flag on the seas, he vehemently refused to attack it, even if he was aware of the riches it held. Teach, however, held no such reservations or illusions, and seemed acutely aware that pirates were enemies to everyone. Whereas Hornigold seemed to be using the pirate life to extend the war experience, Teach embraced the reality of the situation. What they were doing was illegal, but Hornigold seemed to believe that if he avoided attacking the British, they would have no issues with what they were doing. The reality, of course, is that all it would take is one slip-up, and the British would want you dead. To Teach, this is why it didn't matter. The French and the Spanish had impressive military forces of their own. Obviously, Teach and many others had proven that they could face those forces, so why not prey on the British as well? Teach actually wasn't the only one who held this view, because in early November of 1717, Hornigold's crew grew tired of watching British ships filled with loot pass by, and they overthrew the captain. Soon after that happened, Hornigold stated that he planned to retire from piracy and pursue a pardon. Upon his departure, Hornigold took 2 of the 4 ships in the fleet, and Teach was left with the remaining 2. Now, with his mentor's exit, and albeit a small fleet of his own, Teach's transformation into Blackbeard truly began. But if Teach hoped to climb to infamy and guarantee success in his exploits, he was going to need a new ship. Something that could be equipped with more firepower than the 2 sloops of his fleet, but also provided good maneuverability. In mid-November of 1717, he spotted a ship perfectly equipped for the task, which was a French slave ship named the La Concorde. During this period, slavery was the most profitable cargo. Slaves were the most profitable cargo. Many ships specialized in the slave trade, like La Concorde, and ships like those were built for speed and maneuverability. Additionally, these were also usually very large vessels, and their midsection was usually built to hold slaves. Like their midsections is what made them so big, because it was just an entire section that would be hollowed out to carry their cargo, so it's a big ship. Teach saw that as more places to put weapons and store his men, but but also with its speed and capability to hold more weapons and crewmates, Teach knew that this ship would be the perfect flagship for his new fleet. So, Teach's crew and additional ship descended upon La Concorde off the coast of St. Vincent. Both of his vessels quickly surrounded the La Concorde and hit the vessel with broadside cannon fire from both sides. And luckily for Teach, an outbreak of dysentery had weakened the crew of the La Concorde, and they quickly surrendered. Teach and his crew then sailed the ship south to the island of Bequia, and when they arrived, the crew of the La Concorde and the slaves she was carrying were kept in makeshift cages on the island. After a few days, the crew of the La Concorde were released and were given the smaller of Teach's 2 pre-existing sloops. Of course, Teach had removed the cannons from that ship, and then placed them on his new flagship. After that fitting was done, it was then that the La Concorde took on a new name: Queen Anne's Revenge. When Teach and his crew were done refitting the ship for its new purpose, they released the slaves it had once held, a few of whom ended up joining Teach's crew and set off from Bequia. It took less than 3 weeks for Teach to put Queen Anne's Revenge to the test, as on November 28th, 1717, a captain reported an encounter with the vessel. The captain reported being attacked by a French ship armed with 30 or more guns alongside 2 smaller vessels. Now, when, where, or how an additional ship had been added to Teach's fleet is unknown, but added to his fearful and ever-growing presence. The captain estimated that Teach likely had control of over 150 men at this time. The encounter occurred off the shore of St. Vincent, and the captain described it as a rather lengthy encounter, but they were eventually overwhelmed by the pirates. When the captain surrendered, Teach ordered the ship to move closer to shore, and once they were close to the shore, Teach's crew climbed aboard the ship. Later, this ship would be identified as the Grey Allen, but once they were on board, they plundered as much cargo as they could fit among the 3 ships, ordered the entire crew to disembark the Allen, and then set the ship ablaze, which ultimately sank it. Over the following week, Teach worked his way up the Caribbean islands, plundering multiple ships. On December 5th, 1717, he stopped a merchant sloop near Anguilla named the Margaret, captained by a man named Henry Bostock. Now, Teach ordered Bostock to come aboard the Queen Anne, and the reason he did this is because Teach wanted information regarding upcoming trade routes in the Caribbean islands. Bostock and his crew were held captive for an estimated 8 hours. During this time, Bostock took note of Teach's loot and crew. According to Bostock, Teach was in possession of multiple treasures, including a small amount of gold dust and a fancy chalice likely looted from the Great Allen. As for the crew, Bostock estimated that there were at least 300 members of Teach's crew. That, in and of itself, is impressive, but Bostock claimed that the crew also seemed exceptionally healthy for a group of sailors, and were very well stocked on provisions. Once the Margaret, of course, had been stripped of all of her cargo, Teach released Bostock and let them go on their way completely unharmed. The fact that Teach released these men unharmed brings up an interesting aspect of his life as a pirate. Teach never truly murdered anyone. But don't get me wrong, the man definitely killed people, but if he took hostages or prisoners, he always let them go pretty much unharmed. Not only did he refrain from murder, but Bostock also noted that Teach didn't even attempt to harm any of the crew aboard the Margaret. It seemed that Teach preferred to operate in hopes of winning before any blood was spilled, but if you did so happen to meet the man in combat, he would under no circumstance hesitate to kill you. When the Margaret returned to its home port in Antigua on December 19th, Bostock reported the encounter to Governor Walter Hamilton. Once Bostock finished recounting the experience, the governor asked for a description of Captain Teach. From his description, the captain was a tall and skinny man with a very long pitch-black beard. And just like that, Blackbeard was born. Finally, out of the shadow of Hornigold, with a fearsome flagship, fleet, and crew of his own, and now with a simple yet terrifying nickname, Blackbeard became one of the most feared pirates to haunt the waves. After the sacking of the Margaret, Blackbeard's movements are practically unknown until February of 1718. On February 6, 1718, a British warship known as the Scarborough reported spotting a fleet of pirate vessels matching the description of Blackbeard's. Unlike a vast majority of pirate captains at the time, Blackbeard knew when to back away from an encounter. So, despite his impressive fleet and armada, Blackbeard believed the Scarborough posed an unwinnable excursion. The Scarborough's presence there was part of Britain's attempt to combat the ever-growing piracy epidemic in the Caribbean. With the increase of wartime vessels in the Caribbean and legislation being passed like the Transportation Act of 1717, Blackbeard's earlier stance that they were enemies to everyone was ultimately correct. Overall, the Transportation Act was legislation requiring indentured service from criminals guilty of both felonies and misdemeanors. However, a section of the act pertained specifically to piracy. This section mandated that individuals found guilty of piracy would be subjected to capital punishment. Blackbeard's encounter with the Scarborough was enough for him to bid farewell to the Caribbean for good. This was a very smart move because shortly after their encounter, the Scarborough was accompanied by a smaller vessel known as the Seaford to give chase to the pirates. However, Blackbeard was already on his way to Central America. In late March of 1718, Blackbeard was sighted on the Ternef Islands off the coast of Belize. Shortly after their arrival, Blackbeard spotted a sloop approaching the port, to which he sent out his crew on the smaller ships of his fleet to intercept. This sloop was called the Adventure, and upon seeing the approaching vessels flying the black flags, they surrendered without a fight. However, Blackbeard didn't target the Adventure for its loot alone. Instead, he believed the Adventure would make for a great addition to his fleet. When Blackbeard invited the Adventure's captain, David Harriet, to join his fleet, Harriet accepted. Now, upon the surrender of the Adventure, Blackbeard's second-in-command, Israel Hands, was elected to be the new captain of the vessel. In early April, the Queen Anne, Adventure, and Revenge split up to cover a wider area in the Gulf of Honduras. Similar to the capture of the Adventure, Blackbeard was looking for more ships to add to his fleet. The tactic paid off as Blackbeard added another 3-masted ship to his fleet, as well as 3 more sloops. With his new expanded fleet, Blackbeard stopped, looted, and burned a vessel called the Protestant Caesar. After this, Blackbeard and his crew departed from the Gulf with plans of heading north to patrol the coast of the British colonies of North America. However, the Gulf of Honduras has high winds which typically blow south, so to make the voyage as fast as possible, Blackbeard had to cut back through the Caribbean. His first stop was the island of Grand Cayman, where he captured another small ship for his fleet. He then headed northwest towards the Gulf of Mexico, cut around the edge of Cuba before passing Havana, and passed the site of a pair of sunken Spanish fleets off the coast of Florida, before finally reaching the shores of Charleston, South Carolina, in May of 1718. During that journey to the Carolinas, Blackbeard captured and converted another Spanish sloop and was likely responsible for 3 reported pirate attacks on the East Coast. Over the last half century or so before Blackbeard's arrival, Charleston had become a bustling port for ships carrying all manners of cargo. So when the Charleston pilot ship spotted Blackbeard and his fleet around Sullivan's Island, its captain sailed out to meet them in case they needed assistance, most likely not realizing these were Blackbeard and his band of pirates. So the purpose of a pilot ship is to basically serve as a taxi between the port and sailors' ships. Essentially, if your ship won't fit in the harbor but you need to go ashore, the pilot ship will transport both you and your cargo to and from your ship. When the pilot boarded the Queen Anne's Revenge, he was captured and imprisoned alongside the rest of the individuals that were present on the pilot ship. Once the pilot ship and her crew had been captured, Blackbeard formed a blockade around the Charleston bar. Charleston itself is a peninsula surrounded by other pieces of land, which gives sailors a very narrow route out of the port. This is made even worse because of the bar, which is basically a series of submerged shoals or sands found throughout the waters around Charleston. When forming the blockade, Blackbeard knew there was only one route in and out of the Charleston harbor. Additionally, he added the pilot ship to his fleet to lead unsuspecting ships right into this trap. Within days, Blackbeard had stopped and looted around 10 ships, including a large transportation vessel known as the Crowley. As these stoppings and lootings continue, you might wonder how the people of Charleston were unaware of the blockade. Blackbeard, ever the strategist, would stop, loot, and turn away ships in attempting to enter the port. Then, when ships were leaving the port, he would stop, loot, and order the ships to resume their voyage. In addition to control of the pilot ship, Blackbeard had made communication virtually impossible within the Charleston harbor. However, their cover was eventually blown when they were most likely spotted looting a ship by some fishing boats or individuals on shore. When the citizens and merchants of Charleston learned of the blockade, the port was locked down and all vessels were prohibited from leaving. Blackbeard knew that since his cover was now blown, it was only a matter of time before reinforcements would show up to run them out of South Carolinian waters. But before he bid farewell to Charleston, he needed a specific type of cargo: medicine. When the Crowley was captured, one of her occupants was a man named Samuel Wragg. Wragg was a member of the Council of South Carolina, so Blackbeard knew that someone of Wragg's status would be perfect for extortion. While most pirates would use someone like Wragg for money or treasure, Blackbeard only wanted medicine for his crew. However, after thinking it over, Blackbeard wasn't sure that members of the council would allow Wragg to return to the Queen Anne with that medicine. In his place, Blackbeard sent a man known as Mr. Marks and 2 high-ranking pirates from his crew. Before sending them off, Blackbeard threatened that if the group didn't return, he would pull his fleet into the port, burn every vessel, and destroy the town. While Blackbeard undoubtedly said this to add a sense of urgency and pressure the officials of South Carolina, he more than likely could have taken Charleston if he actually wanted to. Despite South Carolina's growth into a bustling port, it was defensively weak, both on land and on the water. Given the weak nature of South Carolina's defenses and the fact that Blackbeard's request wasn't as demanding to usual pirate orders, his offer was quickly accepted by the council. Since the council was now also aware that Wragg was on board the Queen Anne, they sent some chests of money as an extra incentive to release the captives. The incentive actually worked, as Blackbeard released every captive from the Crowley, but of course not before stripping them of all their valuables. After that, the Carolina blockade came to an end. Blackbeard felt that he had outstayed his welcome, but now everyone would know exactly what he was capable of. In little over a week, Blackbeard had brought Charleston to its knees and controlled both the import and export to the town. Even more impressively, he did this without spilling a drop of blood. Now, the question everyone had on their mind was, if he did decide to take a more violent approach in his exploits, what was he actually capable of? While this may have given him a greater reputation as being one of the most cutthroat pirates to ever haunt the waves, it also brought an immense amount of attention to him. Now, the British Royal Navy, as I said earlier, was mostly interested in purging pirates from the Caribbean, but there was also an increase in Navy presence along the east coast of the British colonies. Once word spread of the Charleston Blockade, Blackbeard quickly became enemy number one in the colonies. With a return to the Caribbean being impossible and his newfound notoriety, Blackbeard was in desperate need of a hideout to let the heat die down. The only problem was that he was now in possession of a rather large fleet that would have been difficult to hide. However, Blackbeard knew that the coast of North Carolina could be a decent hiding spot. Unlike South Carolina and Virginia, who were very adamant about combating piracy on the coast, North Carolina and its governor, Charles Eden, weren't as concerned with the pirates. North Carolina was one of the more underdeveloped colonies at the time, and had yet to build a substantial port. Thus, North Carolina had very little military presence on its water, so sometime during the final days of May 1718, Blackbeard set sail for the Beaufort Inlet in North Carolina. When Blackbeard began separating himself from Hornigold around mid-1717, he opted to patrol the colonial coastline while Hornigold continued to prowl the Caribbean. The reason I bring this up is because I want to stress that Blackbeard should have been quite knowledgeable on the terrain of the coast. So what happened next is all the more confusing. On June 10th, 1718, the Queen Anne's Revenge collided with a sandbar off the coast of the Beaufort Inlet. In an instant, the ship's hull suffered immense damage, and the main mast had been cracked. Additionally, the vessel was stuck on the sandbar it collided with. Realizing that the ship was stuck, Blackbeard ordered the Adventure, which was still captained by Israel Hands, to toss a rope onto the ship to tow it out of the sandbar. However, the Adventure only got the Queen Anne more wedged in the sand. Then, even more disastrously, the Adventure collided with the sandbar herself, and also became stuck. With now two vessels, including his flagship, damaged and lodged in the sandbar, Blackbeard opted to declare the ships destroyed and began using them as makeshift shelters. Throughout this video, I've made a point to mention that Blackbeard, by all accounts, was both a master strategist and a competent captain. So why and how could he make such a fatal error of this magnitude? Well, the explanation is pretty simple. It was all a plan. The Charleston Blockade was essentially Blackbeard's magnum opus, and he wanted to end his piracy career on a high note. By this point, Blackbeard had undoubtedly heard of the pardons offered by Britain for acts of piracy. The pardon offered forgiveness for all acts of piracy before September 5th, 1718. A very small part of Blackbeard's crew knew of his plan to pursue a pardon, and those who knew were likely also aware of the plan to destroy and abandon the Queen Anne and the Adventure. Stede Bonnet was actually part of those select few that knew the plan. Bonnet had become little more than a guest on the Queen Anne, but had forged a somewhat decent friendship with Blackbeard. Blackbeard confided in Bonnet that he was planning to accept the pardon. However, there was a bit of a caveat to the pardon. So, while the pardon would be granted to pirates who surrendered before September, it only granted immunity to crimes committed before January 5th, 1718. That meant that Blackbeard would still be held accountable and punished accordingly for the blockade, as well as any other crimes committed over the last few months. But Blackbeard and Bonnet both knew of a loophole. Britain was desperate to bring an end to piracy, so most officials would waive the clause and grant the pardon anyway. As I touched on earlier, Governor Eden of North Carolina was more relaxed about piracy, So Blackbeard figured he would be the easiest official to approach for a pardon, but he needed confirmation before blindly offering himself up to the authorities. So Blackbeard approached Bonnet about the pardon because he figured Bonnet would be the perfect test subject. Blackbeard suggested that Bonnet head to Bath, North Carolina, and approach Governor Eden to request a pardon. Blackbeard must have stressed their situation in Bonnet because with the two grounded ships, they were literally sitting ducks. If the Royal Navy discovered them before they received any pardons, they would surely have been captured and executed. To incentivize Bonnet to surrender and go for the pardon, Blackbeard offered to relinquish the Revenge, which was Bonnet's old ship. He agreed to relinquish it back to him when he returned from getting the pardon. As mentioned before, Bonnet wasn't made for piracy. However, he could serve as a pretty decent privateer captain, and with rumors of a possible war on the horizon, Bonnet wanted his ship and wanted out of piracy. Eventually, Bonnet agreed to the plan, and while he was gone, Blackbeard would stay behind and salvage what he could while awaiting Bonnet's return. Unbeknownst to him, Bonnet had played right into Blackbeard's plan. Upon his arrival in Bath, Bonnet quickly received an audience with Governor Eden, and Eden was exceptionally welcoming, and when Bonnet requested the pardon, Eden quickly approved it and waived the other crimes after January 5th. However, when Bonnet returned to the inlet, he realized he'd been betrayed. In the short time Blackbeard was in the inlet, he likely set up a makeshift base on the mainland to house himself and his crew and hold some of his cargo. Blackbeard had taken control of a small sloop in his fleet to act as a taxi for his men from the doomed vessels to the mainland. Once the majority were on land, Blackbeard sailed out to meet the remainder of Bonnet's men aboard the Revenge. When he arrived, Blackbeard ordered Bonnet's men to come aboard the sloop, and then ordered his own men to strip the Revenge of every last piece of treasure and supplies. While the Queen Anne carried most of the fleet's plunder, when it became grounded, most of it was transferred to the Revenge. So once the looting was finished, Blackbeard sailed off with most of the treasure and about 40 men. It was estimated before this, Blackbeard was in control of about 250 to 300 men. The entire point and plan of this betrayal was essentially to downsize his crew and increase profits for those he chose to bring along. Initially, he planned to bring along the members of Bonnet's crew. However, they were not happy with the betrayal and protested Blackbeard. In response, Blackbeard and his crewmates who had orchestrated the entire plan subdued Bonnet's men and marooned them on a small island in the inlet. Blackbeard then set off for Bath to request a pardon of his own. Blackbeard and his now reduced crew arrived in Bath sometime during the last 2 weeks of June 1718, seeking Governor Eden. When Blackbeard expressed his desire for a pardon, Eden quickly granted it and waived his other crimes. After accepting the pardon, Blackbeard seemingly attempted to settle in Bath, but also established an additional base on Ocracoke Island. While Governor Eden was definitely more lenient towards pirates than other authorities, he aimed to prevent large gatherings of pirates in the colony. To achieve this, Eden offered privateering licenses to pardon pirates, which he was trying to encourage them to engage in legitimate activities instead of causing trouble as pirates. In Blackbeard's case, Eden sweetened the deal by granting him official ownership of the sloop he arrived in Bath with. Usually, ships obtained through piracy remained classified as stolen property, even after receiving a pardon. However, in rare instances, pirates could obtain ownership papers for these vessels from the government. When Blackbeard received ownership papers, he renamed the ship the Adventure, the same name as the vessel lost alongside the Queen Anne's Revenge. Blackbeard's time adhering to the law was short-lived, as he soon resumed piracy in early August. Initially, he just targeted fishing boats and small merchant vessels along the East Coast. These actions also ended up prompting the governor of Pennsylvania to issue a warrant for his arrest. Upon learning of this warrant, Blackbeard quickly fled back to the Caribbean for a few weeks. During his time in the Caribbean, he stopped and looted a few British ships, and around the time Blackbeard figured it was safe to return back to North Carolina, he spotted 2 French vessels traveling outbound from the Caribbean. One of the vessels was filled to the brim with loot, while the other was completely empty. When he stopped both the vessels, he ordered the men aboard the full ship to board the empty one and sent them on their way. Not only did Blackbeard want the loot aboard that ship, but he also wanted the ship itself. So when he returned to North Carolina in September, this surely led to a few glances from the people of North Carolina. The ship was French, and at the time, France and England weren't at war, meaning that the vessel could have only been gained through piracy. That was unless the ship was abandoned. When Blackbeard and his crew finished stripping the ship and selling the cargo at the Bath port, he personally requested an audience with Eden to explain himself. Blackbeard claimed that he and his men had found the ship abandoned, which meant that they were legally allowed to claim her and any cargo she held. When Eden and other members asked for proof that the ship was abandoned, members of Blackbeard's crew gave witness testimonies, and you can probably imagine what they said. The other French vessel and her occupants arrived in Philadelphia shortly after Blackbeard returned, but were unaware that he had taken the ship for himself and was claiming that it was abandoned at sea. Without their side of the story, there was no way to prove that the ship was gained through piracy, so the ship was declared abandoned and Blackbeard got away scot-free. Sometime during the final days of September, Blackbeard's men spotted a ship approaching Ocracoke Island. As it got closer, Blackbeard recognized the ship as being the Ranger, which was captained by Charles Vane. Vane was another large player during the golden age of piracy, and unlike Blackbeard, Vane had no aversion to murder and torture. Despite this, Blackbeard and Vane had a seemingly good friendship, and when Vane came to Ocracoke Island, he, Blackbeard, and members of both crews celebrated for nearly a week. Why exactly Vane sought out Blackbeard is unknown, but we can kind of assume he was most likely there to try to propose an attempt to build a new stronghold, something akin to Nassau. However, Blackbeard seemed to enjoy his current lifestyle over his old one. The prizes were smaller, but so was his crew, and he could just proclaim innocence if he played his cards right. Seeing Blackbeard no longer had the same amount of ambition for piracy as he used to, Vane departed from Ocracoke. In his attempt to feign innocence, Charles Vane was the last person Blackbeard should have been convening with. As said earlier, Vane had violent tendencies and was a rather hot-headed individual. Additionally, Vane was still a pirate through and through and had rejected the pardon at every turn. Tack this on with the fact that the news of Blackbeard's activities in the Caribbean had reached the colonies, he was starting to run out of excuses. Blatant acts of piracy and being seen with one of the most wanted pirates made it obvious to everyone Blackbeard never truly retired. News of the pirate gathering on Ocracoke was seen as such an urgent issue that the governor of Pennsylvania deployed multiple sloops to patrol Delaware Bay. The hope was to capture either Vane or Blackbeard, who had previously haunted the bay for a short time. These efforts were fruitless because Blackbeard remained on Ocracoke while Vane returned to the Caribbean. By now, Charles Eden would have undoubtedly known of Blackbeard's return to piracy, but for some reason he had seemingly given up questioning his activity. Both in the past and present, some believed Eden and Blackbeard had made a deal where Eden received a share of the profits that Blackbeard earned in return for him turning a blind eye. Possibly having the North Carolina governor in his pocket, and seeing as the Pennsylvania government was only interested in protecting their closest waters, Blackbeard likely felt invincible. However, just to the north, the governor of Virginia, Alexander Spotswood, was putting together a plan to deal with Blackbeard and piracy as a whole. In June of 1718, Spotswood proclaimed that any pirates present in Virginia had to register their presence even if they were pardoned. As for those who were pardoned, Spotswood still saw these individuals as threats because he believed as soon as these former pirates ran out of money, they would go right back out to sea. To further deter those activities, Spotswood made it illegal for any individuals linked to piracy, past or present, to gather in groups of 3 or more. Soon after these proclamations, members of Blackbeard's crew he abandoned at Beaufort began settling in the colonies, including Virginia. And due to the requirement of registering oneself, Spotswood was made aware that the former quartermaster of the Queen Anne's Revenge William Howard, had arrived in Williamsburg shortly after the incident at Beaufort. Spotswood felt he could use Howard as a message to deter piracy, so he had him arrested and imprisoned on a vessel called the HMS Lime. As the authorities began building a case against Howard and Blackbeard, Howard managed to contact his lawyer, John Holloway. Holloway was among the best lawyers in the colonies at the time, which would have been horrible news for Spotswood. At the time of Howard's imprisonment, colonial governors had no jurisdiction to try men for acts of piracy. Additionally, Spotswood had no authority to arrest anyone without a proper trial, nor did he have the right to confiscate someone's property after their arrest, as he did with Howard. But Spotswood found a loophole in a decree by William III, the at the time King of England, where a governor could try a pirate in a time of crisis. In his eyes, Blackbeard's presence in the neighboring colony of North Carolina qualified as a crisis. With this loophole, Spotswood began throwing the entire book at both Howard and Blackbeard. Firstly, Spotswood claimed that neither man should have been eligible for the pardon because there were documented accounts of their acts of piracy after January 5th, 1718. What he failed to mention was that Eden had already extended the pardon, meaning both men were technically innocent. Secondly, Spotswood claimed the Spanish ship Blackbeard owned, the one renamed the Adventure, was gained through piracy and was illegally owned. While the ship was actually gained through piracy, when Blackbeard received the pardon, Eden assigned him legal ownership of the Adventure. What makes all of this even worse is that every part of this is technically illegal on Spotswood's part. Since Blackbeard and his men had received a pardon from North Carolina, if there was even a suspicion of piratical activity that breached the pardon, any legal proceedings against the pirates were the responsibility of the colony that issued the pardon. So Spotswood and the legal counsel were technically acting outside of their jurisdiction. In addition to the earlier loophole we discussed, Spotswood was permitted to continue the investigation because Virginia outranked North Carolina. At the time, Virginia was a royal colony, which meant Spotswood was personally appointed as governor of Virginia by the king. North Carolina, however, was a proprietary colony, which meant that the governors were appointed by a group of the king's proprietors and were a little bit more independent than those of the royal colonies. Spotswood used that to argue that Eden and the legal council of North Carolina were unfit to handle pirates, leaving officials like him to take matters into their own hands. And surprisingly, these arguments worked. Now, when it came time for Howard's trial, members of the jury and council refused to attend if Holloway was present. The reasons for this are dubious at best, and honestly, in my opinion, it seems that this may have been by Spotswood's design, because those who refused to attend the hearings were known associates of his. Holloway was famous in the colonies for his work as a lawyer, and I think that Spotswood knew Holloway would find all the gaps in his story and prove the innocence of both Howard and Blackbeard. If Spotswood allowed that to happen, not only would it be a major blow to Virginia's legal counsel, but would also allow Blackbeard to continue residing just south of Virginia with full legal immunity. Since members continuously refused to attend if Holloway was present, he eventually surrendered the case. He was replaced by John Clayton, the at the time Attorney General of Virginia, which only adds to my suspicion of this entire case. Wouldn't you know it, Spotswood was good friends with Clayton, and after the replacement, Spotswood claimed that Clayton was a much more honest man than Holloway. But, you know, if you have some sort of issue with a lawyer who is famous among the common people for always providing fantastic representation in your cases, you might be the real problem. Anyways, after the replacement, the trial was held, and you can probably assume the outcome. Howard and Blackbeard were both found guilty of piracy, resulting in Howard being placed in a Williamsburg prison awaiting execution, and Blackbeard being declared a wanted man. Howard's execution was set for December 1718, but a later addition to the pardon moved the grace period from January 5th to July 23rd. Since the Beaufort Inlet incident occurred in June and Howard had gone straight afterward, He was released in the fall of 1718. As for Blackbeard, the guilty verdict meant he was once again a wanted man. More importantly for Spotswood, the guilty verdict meant that their acting out of jurisdiction was a little more ambiguous. While they would still technically be out of jurisdiction and technically operating illegally, it would be easier to argue that their next actions were justifiable and Blackbeard's presence was actually a crisis. So Spotswood wasted no more time, and in the early days of November 1718, he began putting together a plan and a crew to put an end to Blackbeard. First, Spotswood needed a small crew and fleet that would willingly pursue one of the most feared pirates in history. His earliest supporters were Captain Brand and Gordon of the HMS Pearl and Lime. The Lime, if you remember, was the same vessel Howard was imprisoned on while awaiting trial, so it is really no surprise that the Lime and her crew were more than prepared to face Blackbeard. Of the two, Brand was of higher rank, so he was placed in command of the operation. Now, Spotswood had it on pretty good authority that Blackbeard frequently haunted Bath, North Carolina, and knew of his rumored stronghold on Ocracoke Island. However, in possibly another testament to Blackbeard's maritime prowess, the waters connecting Bath and Ocracoke are pretty shallow. So shallow that bulky warships, like the Pearl and Lime, would find it impossible to sail in those waters. If it was impossible to launch a full frontal assault, they would need to attempt a more covert operation. To do this, Spotswood personally rented 2 civilian vessels to use in the assault. The plan was to surround Blackbeard in Bath. A large military group would approach Bath on foot and push Blackbeard towards the harbor. The 2 sloops Spotswood rented were to form a blockade around Bath to prevent Blackbeard from escaping if he attempted to flee to sea. It was decided that Brand would lead the forces on land while his first lieutenant Robert Maynard would take control of the 2 sloops. According to reports, Maynard was a well-established sailor who had been serving as a lieutenant for over a decade, meaning he was more than qualified for this operation. So on the morning of November 17th, 1718, Maynard departed from what is present-day Hampton, Virginia, en route to Bath, North Carolina. The 2 ships, now nicknamed the Jane and Ranger, were left unarmed and were occupied by little more than 60 men combined. The reason for this was that Spotswood wanted the operation completed as quickly as possible. Because this was still out of Spotswood jurisdiction, and technically illegal, Spotswood wanted Blackbeard captured or killed before any North Carolina officials became too privy to the operation. So using fewer men and keeping the ships unarmed meant that they weighed substantially less, and less weight meant quicker travel. Over the following days, while continuing down the coast, Maynard would stop vessels he assumed to be pirate vessels. He did this to make sure Blackbeard nor any of his crew were attempting to escape North Carolina. Additionally, he would question the captains of these vessels about Blackbeard's possible location. Eventually, Maynard learned that Blackbeard wasn't in Bath at all. Instead, he had most recently been seen aboard his sloop, the Adventure, on Ocracoke Island. With no way to communicate with Spotswood or Brand about this, Maynard decided he and his crew would attempt to combat Blackbeard on their own. Under most circumstances, the idea of an improvised attack like this would be a horrible idea. However, Maynard had also learned that Israel Hands and several members of Blackbeard's crew were in Bath. Knowing this, Maynard timed his vessel to arrive near Ocracoke on the night of November 21st, 1718. Immediately, Maynard formed a blockade to stop any vessels from entering the coast to prevent their cover being blown. Interestingly, Maynard and his men could easily see the top of the Adventure behind the hills of Ocracoke, and by all accounts, Blackbeard should have been perfectly capable of spotting the vessels on the opposite side. However, it appears that Blackbeard had become complacent and believed himself to be invincible from any legal trouble. Additionally, on the night of the 21st, he was hosting a party with some merchant captains who frequented Bath. Since it was a party and these are pirates, there was likely a significant amount of alcohol present, and possibly due to that and or his complacency, Blackbeard had no lookout stationed on the night of the 21st. At first, Maynard wanted to move on Blackbeard during the night, but since these were unfamiliar waters, he opted to wait until the morning. After daybreak on November 22nd, 1718, Maynard halted a depth-sounding boat to understand the depth of the water surrounding Ocracoke. He determined that this small boat could serve a greater purpose by leading them directly to Blackbeard, thus avoiding grounding themselves in the shallow waters. As that small boat entered the channel, Blackbeard and his men must have spotted the two larger ships that were following it, which prompted the adventurer to immediately fire a warning shot at the small boat. As the boat retreated to the two sloops, Blackbeard cut the anchor line of the Adventure. Jane and Ranger had not yet unfurled their flags, so Blackbeard was entirely unaware of who he was dealing with, but he was pretty certain they were looking for a fight. He estimated that at the rate the two sloops were traveling, they would be upon him in about 20 minutes. This wouldn't give him nearly enough time to raise the anchor, which is why he opted to cut it. Once the Adventure was free, it should have been relatively easy for Blackbeard to raise sail, head north, and escape the Sound, since the Adventure could easily outpace the Jane and Ranger. However, much like the Charleston Blockade, Blackbeard wanted to prove a point. After cutting the anchor, Blackbeard ordered the ship to turn perpendicularly to the approaching vessels and prepare to fire. After about 15 minutes, the two ships were within range of the Adventure's guns. Since they were sailing directly towards the Adventure, they ran the risk of cannon fire ripping across the entire deck of the vessels. Maynard seemed to have considered this exact scenario and had ordered the vast majority of his crew to stay below deck. As the sloops moved closer, they finally unfurled the Union Jack, making Blackbeard now well aware of who he was dealing with. Possibly because of this, Blackbeard opted to not fire on the sloops and instead turned back towards Ocracoke Island, heading in the direction of a narrow channel on the island. More than likely, however, Blackbeard was trying to use his knowledge of these waters to his advantage. Considering the two vessels had to be led by a sounding boat, he was pretty certain these attackers were not knowledgeable about the sandbars present around Ocracoke, one of which ran parallel to the beaches of Ocracoke. While Blackbeard attempted to flee to the channel, Maynard and the two sloops came within less than 100 yards of the Adventure. At this distance, Maynard and Blackbeard could hear each other, and they exchanged a few words. According to Maynard, Blackbeard raised a drink to the damnation awaiting Maynard and his men, as well as calling them all cowards. Blackbeard ended the conversation by proclaiming he would show nor take no quarter, essentially meaning that if they wanted him, they would have to kill him. After the two exchanged those words, Maynard fired upon the Adventure. As you may recall, the two sloops were without cannons, so instead the men aboard were armed with muskets and flintlocks, which is why they had to get so close before engaging. In response to them firing with the muskets and flintlocks, Blackbeard returned fire on the two vessels, which resulted in nearly 30 of Maynard's crew being killed in an instant. A vast majority of those killed by the first blast were on board the Ranger. The ship's captain, Mr. Hyde, was also among those killed, and the Ranger was so badly damaged that it was decommissioned for the climax of the battle. What happened next is uncertain, has been heavily debated throughout history. Some sources claim that after the initial blast, the Adventure ran aground on a sandbar, while others argue that the Ranger ran aground instead. There are even accounts suggesting that both ships might have ran aground around the same time. These next few events suggest that the Adventure might have been the only ship to run aground. After the Adventure had inflicted significant casualties on Maynard's crew, Maynard devised a plan to lure Blackbeard onto the Jane. He ordered the men back below deck to create the illusion that a majority of the ship's crew had been killed. This ruse would have been compromised if the Jane had run aground, because Maynard's crew would have had to exit the hold to lighten the load of the ship to refloat it. Therefore, it is far more likely that the Adventure got stuck on a sandbar. In an attempt to avoid a secondary blast and to feign weakness, Maynard ordered the Jane to keep their distance from the Adventure. The plan was to deceive Blackbeard into believing that a majority of the Jane's crew had been killed. Then they would pretend to retreat and allow themselves to be boarded by Blackbeard, at which point the men below deck would emerge and overwhelm Blackbeard and his crew. And the plan worked. Once the Adventure was free of the sandbar, she turned towards the Jane and rapidly approached. Just before the ships were side by side, Blackbeard ordered grenades to be tossed on the deck of the Jane. He wanted to ensure that there would be no resistance once he boarded, but unfortunately for him, and miraculously for Maynard, not a single grenade made its way below the deck of the Jane. The crew of the Adventure then threw grappling hooks over the Jane's deck, and the two ships were now locked together. Once Blackbeard and around a dozen other pirates boarded the Jane, Maynard gave the signal for his men to rush out of the hold. It's estimated that Maynard had fewer than a dozen men remaining, but while they were outnumbered, they still had the element of surprise. When the battle first began, Blackbeard and Maynard singled each other out and initially attempted to fire their flintlocks at each other. Blackbeard's shot missed, but Maynard struck Blackbeard in the abdomen. However, Blackbeard seemed completely unaffected by the shot, and since flintlocks were only single-shot weapons, both men threw their empty firearms at each other, most likely trying to hit the other person in the head with it. Both men missed this time and drew their cutlasses to engage each other in close-quarters combat. As I mentioned earlier, while Blackbeard was not a murderer and preferred to use his appearance to end the battle before any blood was spilled, he was in no way a weak man. Those who engaged Blackbeard in hand-to-hand combat and lived to tell the tale reported that he was a ferocious fighter and exceptionally strong. A testament to this was when Maynard and Blackbeard first engaged each other with their swords. Maynard thrusted his swords towards Blackbeard's chest, but Blackbeard was protected by an ammo bag strapped to his jacket. Within a second of that happening, Blackbeard broke the guard on Maynard's sword, which also injured Maynard's fingers. After this, Maynard took a few steps back, pulled out a second flintlock, and once again landed a shot to Blackbeard's torso. Still, Blackbeard seemed completely unaffected. He marched towards Maynard, who was struggling to dispose of the split flintlock and raise his sword due to his injured hand. As he approached Maynard to administer the killing blow, a member of Maynard's crew sliced across Blackbeard's face and neck. Yet he still continued to fight with every ounce of energy, but he was starting to fade. He soon became surrounded and received around 25 additional wounds, 5 of which were from flintlocks. Again, what happens next is subject to historical debate, but it is widely believed that Blackbeard received a blow across his neck, which beheaded him, and obviously he fell dead. As their captain fell dead, Blackbeard's men aboard the Jane surrendered, and back on the Adventure, the remaining men found themselves under siege by the Ranger, which had somewhat rallied to rejoin the fight against them. They took the fight to Blackbeard's remaining men, who eventually surrendered as well. Below deck, the men found Blackbeard's last, albeit bizarre, line of defense. He had placed a crewmate in the gunpowder storage area and ordered him to ignite the powder if Blackbeard began losing the fight. However, this crewmate seemed entirely unaware of what had transpired, and when the Ranger's men found him aboard, he attempted to light a match but was stopped before he could do so. With that, the battle was over, and arguably the most infamous pirate in history lay dead on the deck of the Jane. With Blackbeard dead and his remaining crew captured, Maynard remained around Ocracoke for the next few days while the 3 ships were repaired and the dead were buried. Maynard received word that Brand arrived in Bath on the 23rd, and he sent a smaller vessel out to deliver the news of Blackbeard's demise. Before leaving Ocracoke, Maynard decided that Blackbeard's body could serve as an effective message for what awaited any other pirates. Whether he was beheaded in battle or after the fact, Blackbeard's head was removed and his body was thrown overboard. His head was kept as a token of proof of his demise and was then hung from the bow of the Jane. Maynard arrived in Bath shortly after to check in with Brand and determine their next course of action. Maynard was ordered to return to Virginia while Brand stayed behind to track down the remainder of Blackbeard's crew. Before he left, Maynard surrendered the Adventure to the authorities in Bath and set out on the journey back to Virginia with Blackbeard's head still hanging from the bow. Brand eventually located all of Blackbeard's remaining crew, had them arrested, and then later sent them all to Williamsburg, Virginia, where they awaited trial for acts of piracy. Additionally, Brand located some of Blackbeard's loot he'd left behind in Bath, which would award them some extra cash on top of the bounty. However, the location where this loot was found sort of became a source of contention. By then, Governor Eden of North Carolina was well aware of Governor Spotswood's overreach and the Virginia military operating on North Carolina grounds. North Carolina was in no position to oppose Virginia military, so Eden pursued a legal case against Spotswood over the invasion. He intensified his pursuit when Brand and his men seized goods from his and his second's personal storehouses. Brand assumed, much like Spotswood, that Eden was in cahoots with Blackbeard, meaning all of his property had been gained through piracy, making them fair game for seizure. However, alongside the fact that Eden claimed all of the assets were gained illegally, he argued that even if these did so happen to be stolen goods, they still belonged to North Carolina and had to be sold at an auction within the state. Despite Eden's objections, Brand ordered the seized goods to be shipped to Virginia, where they were then sold at auction. When Eden sent a letter demanding an explanation from Spotswood about Brand's behavior, Spotswood stated that he had no knowledge of Brand's actions after Blackbeard's death. Unsurprisingly, this was later proven to be a lie, as Spotswood had personally ordered the seizure of Eden's goods. Regardless, a legal war was brewing between the two colonies, and with tensions rising, Brand decided he shouldn't linger in Bath much longer, and most likely he began the journey back to Williamsburg in the second week of December. 2 weeks earlier, on December 1st, 1718, Maynard regrouped with the HMS Lyme and Pearl in Hampton, and the crews of the two ships cheered when they saw Blackbeard's head hanging from the bow of the Jane. Since Blackbeard's head hanging from the Jane signaled that Maynard had been successful in the defeat of the pirate. Captain Gordon ordered all of Maynard's injured men to come aboard the two warships and approved Maynard to return to Williamsburg, which he did the following day. When he arrived with Blackbeard's head still dangling from the bow, he was greeted by a cheering audience as well as military personnel on standby to transport the captured pirates to jail. Under normal circumstances, the captured pirates would have been quickly tried and executed. However, Spotswood needed Blackbeard's men alive to justify his invasion of North Carolina. Once they had outlived their usefulness, all but a couple of the pirates were executed by hanging. Spotswood and Eden engaged in legal conflict for years until Eden passed away in March of 1722. Later that year, Spotswood was replaced as governor due to increasing disapproval from his fellow councilmen of Virginia. Now, as for Blackbeard's head, similar to several other aspects of the story, it remains uncertain what exactly happened to it. There are plenty of rumors about its fate. For one, it is believed that his head was removed from the Jane upon her arrival and then hung from a pole in Hampton as a warning to any other would-be pirates. Supposedly, it remained there for years until it deteriorated to just a skull. This story is probably true, because even to this day, the section where his head reportedly hung is still named Blackbeard's Point. However, what happened after that is what is still up for debate. According to legend, after it was removed from the pole, the skull purportedly found its way to a Williamsburg tavern, where it eventually was plated in silver and transformed into a sort of novelty drinking bowl. Then the skull reportedly changed hands among various owners for over 200 years before it, or another object resembling it, ended up in a museum in Salem, Massachusetts. While the museum does indeed possess a skull matching the description of Blackbeard's reported skull, they do not display it due to the lack of means to verify its authenticity. Whether this skull was that of Blackbeard or not, it does prove one thing. Even death itself could not dampen his sheer aura and reputation. As I said, to this day there are multiple rumors about Blackbeard's skull, as well as a belief that Blackbeard's spirit haunts the waters of Ocracoke searching for his severed head. Now, as for solid physical traces of Blackbeard's presence, in 1996 a shipwreck was found in the Beaufort Inlet and was believed to be the Queen Anne's Revenge. Over the following years, artifacts were recovered from the wreck, and in 2011, after recovering a sufficient amount of evidence, North Carolina officially declared the wreck as that of the Queen Anne's Revenge. And lastly, what pirate story would be complete without the allure of buried treasure? Since his time in Bath, it has been believed that Blackbeard stashed a trove of treasure there. Even to this day, people search Bath and Ocracoke in hopes of uncovering Blackbeard's fabled riches. However, the reality is likely less fantastical. While buried treasure has become synonymous with pirates in popular culture, historically only one pirate has ever really been confirmed to have buried treasure, which was William Kidd. So while it's exciting to entertain the idea of hidden pirate wealth and the thrill of discovering that wealth, Blackbeard likely never buried any treasures. Instead, he likely stored them at his headquarters in Bath and Ocracoke and aboard the Adventurer, which were, of course, all confiscated. With that, our story of Edward Blackbeard Teach comes to an end. I'd say it's pretty easy to see why he has the reputation he does, but what kind of makes it funny is that despite his reputation and infamy, he was nowhere near the most successful pirate of his age. His reputation was pretty much solely based on his appearance and demeanor, and you know what? It worked. What makes it even more impressive is the fact that the persona of Blackbeard only existed for about 11 months before his death, yet most people remember those 11 months of his life more than the 30 plus years of his life that led to those. In the present, most people seem to look back somewhat fondly on pirates and their exploits, and that seems to go doubly for Blackbeard, who is seen as more of an anti-hero type of figure, and I honestly think that's a pretty fair assessment for him. While he was undoubtedly still a criminal, he still had an anti-establishment mentality, and aside from stripping people of their valuables and loot, he really didn't wish any ill will on almost everyone he encountered. And I'll be honest, it helps that the figure he cut had a pretty insane cool factor that heavily inspired the sort of de facto pirate appearance we think of today. I would say it's so infamous that, his figure, the pirate figure that like a lot is based off of Blackbeard, is pretty, like, it's going to stand the test of time. Because, Blackbeard still continues to appear in television shows, he's in movies, he's in video games, he's in all sorts of types of media. So it's time for my sort of personal thoughts. If you're here for just the Blackbeard part, that part's over. This is just, I'm going to not talk as much as I usually do at the end of these videos, but I just want to give my personal thoughts and talk about a couple things. So as for Blackbeard, I think it's pretty obvious that I really like the story of Blackbeard. And I won't lie that my interest in this story came from me playing Assassin's Creed Black Flag all the way back in 2013. More than likely, I'd heard of Blackbeard before then, but that was kind of my first profound exposure to him, and I've been pretty fascinated with him and piracy as a whole since then. Speaking of which, if you liked this video, make sure to let me know in the comments if you'd like to see me cover more pirates in the future, because I'd definitely be down to do that. Also, this was the first video I've done where our story has virtually no paranormal context, besides the rumor of Teach's spirit looking for his head. Besides the paranormal, history has always been a subject I've loved to both talk about and learn about. So again, if you enjoyed this video and want to see more historical videos, let me know. I do want to touch on a couple things I didn't have wrote in my outline. So this right here and the shirt that I'm wearing are heavily based off of the reported flag Blackbeard flew on his ship. I'll probably throw a picture of it up over here somewhere. In all actuality, while I was doing research, as cool as that flag is, while I was doing research, it's likely that that's not what his flag looked like. More than likely, for most records, it's likely he just flew the standard black flag that most pirates flew. But I think it looks cool. I bought the flag and the shirt, so obviously I like it. I think it's cool, but probably not historically accurate, but whatever. Besides that, I don't think I have really anything much else to say, except thank you all for watching, thank you for the continued support and patience as I work these things out. I know I said I didn't want to. I did keep my promise from the last video. It's not going to be 3 months since this video, since the gap between the last video and this one, but it's still a little longer than I was hoping for. But when I start working on these subjects, no matter what I do, I end up getting really invested into them, and my brain just starts taking over, and I just get stuck in the details. I'm trying to get a little bit better at that, about like cutting out sort of useless details, but I try to be as thorough as possible. I try to build the story. I hope it's entertaining. The next one I'm working on after this is another big one. I'm hoping it's not going to be 3 months for that video, but I'm telling you, it's a big one, and it's going to take a lot of time. While I was recording the Dyatlov Pass video and I was editing it, I already had the outline for this video done. It's been 2 months. Well, it's probably been about a month and a half since I've had the outline for this video done, but I'm still working on the outline for the next video. So yeah, and it's going to be a big one because I'm still in the very beginning of it, but I think it'll be worth it because it's a topic that I absolutely love, and I love to talk about. And I mean, I love to talk about all these things, but it's one of like the big ones. It's one of like the big mystery cases. So I'm really excited to work on that one. It's just making my brain hurt a lot. Which, as you know, I kind of like these stories that make my brain hurt. It's very much akin to the Dyatlov Pass thing, is that the more confused I kind of am throughout it, the more I get to kind of learn about like the mystery elements behind it. Like, for example, the Dyatlov Pass video, there was stuff I talked about in the explanations that I would have never heard of had it not been for that case, like the Karman vortexes and stuff. So I love getting into these topics and really learning about them, because I learn a lot more than just about the cases. I learn about the like logistics of cases and stuff like that. This is obviously a little different because this is a history video, but I love history. Like I said, you want to see me talk about it more, I would love to do so. I'm probably going to do it anyways, but I'm hoping this video doesn't tank because it's not paranormal. But I don't want to do paranormal only stuff. As much as I love doing paranormal stuff, I don't want to do paranormal only. I want to start branching out and doing some other things. I would say a majority of my videos will still probably be paranormal adjacent, but I'm going to try to switch it up every now and then and do something else, or more than likely just talk about history. But yeah, this is fun. Having a great time. You all are killing it. For some reason, some of my older videos started like popping off really hard again. I mean, I'm not going to complain about it. It's just been crazy to see. I'm glad you all liked the Dyatlov Pass video. I was worried with how long it was between that video and the video before it. It was not going to do as well, but then it ended up being one of my best performing. So yeah, I really appreciate that. But I think now I'm going to stop rambling. Thank you all again for watching. Thank you for the continued support, the patience as I work on these things. And as always, I hope to see you all again soon.